Hello there, people of the internet. I have a couple of old school military surplus firearms on the table right now. These right here are what I would consider to be old school, like yesterday, previous generation fighting rifles. And whenever I say previous generation, I don't mean like human generations, because our modern firearms were designed in the 1950s. Previous generation, I'm talking about firearms generations. There's different generations throughout firearms. Maybe I'll make a video talking about that in the future. But my context behind picking these firearms, not necessarily these specific ones, there are other things that you could put on the table. This right here is just what I happen to think about. The concept behind these firearms that I'm showing is that these are the best old school firearms, the old school fighting rifles that you could use if you were to decide using old school fighting rifle in modern day. That being said, that is not an ideal situation. That's definitely not something that you would want to do. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go with the oldest design that is still probably the best design of the oldest designs, and that's going to be our Ishapur. In this case, this is a 2A1, chambered in 7.62 NATO, 10-round magazine. It's external. You can take the mag out, put a new mag in whenever you run out of ammo, so you don't have to feed with stripper clips if you don't want to. It's got a short bolt throw, fast cycling. A lot of people can fire these quite fast with just the most minute amount of practice, especially if you have magazines that feed reliably. It's got good sights on it. It's just an all-around fairly decent rifle. And it should provide about the same rate of fire, maybe a little bit less since it does have that manual operation to it, but about the same rate of fire as aimed fire from any self-loading full-power rifle. Since this is chambered in 7.62 NATO, the ammunition for it, at least right now in the United States, is very readily available. That's what makes this such a good pick. Now, this right here is actually a design that is based off of things from like the 1890s or 1880s, if we want to get real technical about it. But during that time period, that's basically when all countries were coming out with some sort of magazine-fed repeating bolt-action rifle. This right here was just the best design that stands up to today's standards just because of that 7.62 NATO chambering, even though it does have the really, really, really old school design. So this is actually a previous generation past the previous generation, I suppose. I wanted to put this on the table because even in a modern context, if you had this right here, you would still not be that bad off. Definitely not ideal, but far from the worst situation. Like if you were to have something like a Mauser, 8mm Mauser, is something that would be much more difficult to find in any sort of SHTF situation than something like, say, 7.62 NATO. Alright, up next, this is actually a World War II era rifle, the SKS. Actually, both of these are, well, actually, that one right there is a pre-World War II era rifle. But the SKS is probably going to be the best military surplus weapon that you're going to take for practical purposes if we're talking about using an old previous generation fighting rifle in the modern day. And these right here are actually ones that are still being used literally to this day on modern battlefields in very modern contexts. It's an intermediate cartridge, and that's one of the big turning points for the SKS, like one of the huge checkpoints on the SKS. You can carry a lot of ammunition for this thing in comparison to something like a full power rifle, like in comparison to a loadout for your M1 Garand, which we'll get to here in a second. Self-loading rifle, 10-round magazine fed with stripper clips. You can carry a lot of ammo on those stripper clips in comparison to weight-wise the AK-47 with its magazines. As a matter of fact, I made a video where I did some math talking about the differences between those. And if we're talking about the weight-to-weight ratio, you can carry 50% more ammo for the SKS on stripper clips than you can for the AK with its magazines. So that's definitely a huge plus for this rifle if you decide to go with it. Definitely not ideal. You can't mount optics on it. You can't mount lights, lasers, rails, etc., without some serious modification of the firearm. But if you're modifying the firearm in any way whatsoever, then it's no longer a previous generation firearm. It is now an updated version for the modern generations. So if you are going to argue the SKS for a previous generation fighting rifle, then guess what? You got to go with the previous generation fighting rifle, and you can't turn it into something new. You can't make like a modern AK out of an SKS because then you just basically have a modern AK. Alright. There is a really good option, and one that I am honestly, like, foaming at the mouth over recently. The SKS has kind of been my obsession over the past, I don't know, month or so. Okay, up next, the M1 Grand. This is pre-World War II technology. This was actually designed in the 1930s, and it was what made countries realize how effective a self-loading rifle as a standard infantry rifle would be. A lot of other countries out there did have self-loading rifles, but they were not issued to everybody, like the M1 Grand was, short of the Marine Corps, I suppose, for a time. So, self-loading rifle chambered in 30-06. 30-06 is very easily found here in the United States. It is literally everywhere. You go check in Grandpa's closet, find his hunting rifle, odds are it's going to be something in 30-06. Hunters all over the place use it in 30-06, or use their hunting rifles in 30-06. Great sights on this thing, peep sights, really, really accurate rifle. Although it only holds 8 rounds of in-block clip, it is very easy to reload, very quick to reload. There's, especially with some practice, there's plenty of videos out there, including of myself reloading the M1 Grand. Does not take all that long or all that much effort. And if you're using a battle rifle like this, odds are you're shooting at something at a distance, so you will have time to be able to reload, especially if you have a group of buddies who is also sending lead down range at whatever target it is that you're shooting at, so you should be okay with that. Again, this previous generation fighting rifle is not an ideal modern day fighting rifle. However, there are modern day fighting rifles that are based off of this previous generation one, like the M14 is still in service in many places all around the world. But that has an external magazine. Some of them are select fire still. A lot of them have been converted back to semi-auto because select fire is basically useless in that platform. They got their upgrades. They got a better gas system. They got their own quirks. If you're having M1 Grand and you want to be able to use all kinds of 30-06 in it, make sure you update your gas system so you don't accidentally bend your operating rod. It's a pretty gosh darn easy procedure, and I think I've even made videos on updating your M1 Grand's gas system. But this right here is another example of a previous generation fighting rifle that would probably still hold its own in today's standards. All of these I would consider to be antiquated, and well, whenever I say antiquated, I don't mean that it's not good. I don't mean that it's a bad design that won't hold up in modern standards. It's just not as modern as some of the things that we have nowadays. Like, for example, this right here, difficult to mount optics to. Especially since it's got its ejection and reloading system. It's just a design that wasn't meant for the optics situations that we have nowadays. More difficult to mount lights and lasers and whatever it is that you want to it. I definitely always recommend that you have at least a white light on your firearm, especially if you're going to be using it for practical applications. In these previous generations, they just did not have that technology available to them whenever these rifles were being designed, so they just weren't designed around that premise. That being said, this right here, along with those other two that I showed, if you know what you're doing with them, you're trained with them, you are fairly capable with them, and you're tactically sound to not just run out and get yourself killed like I have seen. You know what? Never mind. If you trained with your firearm and you know it like the back of your hand, fear the man with one gun, even if the gun is not all that great, because he knows it very, very well. A guy with this M1 Grand, let's put the M1 Grand in the hands of a Marine, and let's give a civilian shooter an AR-15. My money is on the Marine every single time, just because of that Marine's training and proficiency. Anyway, folks, thanks for watching. Appreciate your time. Like, subscribe, share. Description below has a link to all sorts of stuff. Go check it out. You guys go off, have yourself a fantastic day. I'll see you all in the next episode. since I've done this. Bonnie and Clyde be damned. Poor man's Garen. It's a shame that bolt-action shotguns aren't more mainstream.